upon the breakout, gold's going to make a new all-time highs.
Gold-backed ETFs in inflows of over $5 billion.
$0.8 trillion gold market.
Why are we the only guys that seem to understand this?
Makes your head spin. Hi, welcome to Live from the Vault. My name is Shane Moran, and I'll be your host for today's episode. And boy, do we have some breaking news for you today. Last week with Bill Murphy, we told you we had another blockbuster episode for you this week, and we certainly do. Breaking news coming your way. Let's get right to talking gold with Andy Maguire and our special guest. Andy, over to you.
Hey, thank you, Shane. Welcome to Talking Gold with myself, Andrew Maguire. Now, in each episode, we bring you the latest gold and silver news, as well as the best industry guests possible. Now, today, we've none other than Gold Antitrust Action Committee's Treasury Secretary, Chris Powell. He's joined us today, and this is huge for us. And if this was not enough, I'm also going to break some groundbreaking industry news. Now, Chris, it's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to have you join us in our Talking Gold episode today. And I know a lot of people have been looking forward to it. Perhaps not the BIS or some of the industry apologists, though. And we know who they are, Chris. But now, although I've been reading your work for many years, I first had the absolute honor of meeting you personally when you invited me to speak at GATA's Gold Rush 2011 conference. And that was my first public appearance after GATA had presented our bombshell market manipulation evidence at the televised March 2010 CFTC Metals Inquiry meeting that was called by our dear friend, departed friend, Bart Chilton. Now, in our last episode, your fellow director and GATA chairman, Bill Murphy, joined us. Look, I cannot thank him enough. And Chris, the feedback we got after the interview was absolutely fantastic. And interestingly, it also generated some good questions from people who had not heard of GATA before. And I know they're looking forward to this episode. So Chris, can we start by you telling everyone about GATA's background and what it does?
Sure. We were started as a nonprofit civil rights and educational organization in January '99, largely on the basis of our chairman, Bill Murphy's commentaries at lametropolecafe.com. Bill was a former futures trader. He'd noticed that the gold market seemed to be highly manipulated. I got a little tired of hearing that from him when I was reading his commentaries, and I had some familiarity with antitrust law, and I told him, listen, why don't we start a committee? I'll donate $500 to it, try to hire some antitrust lawyers on a contingency basis. We'll sue the bastards and collect triple damages. And if only it had been that easy. We did hire some lawyers, and we very quickly found out that the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 fully authorizes the United States government to rig not only the gold market, but any market in the world. And then we realized, well, suing the government was foreclosed because they had the immunity probably might be applied to any agents they were working through. So we decided that the best we could do would be to research the policy, expose it and its mechanisms, and try to gain the attention of the markets and the mainstream financial news organizations to stop it by publicity. We have, in the course of 20 years, collected an immense amount of documentation from various governments and leading organizations confirming that gold price intervention surreptitiously by governments. Getting the mainstream financial news organizations to acknowledge it has been close to impossible, not totally impossible. We have gotten a little publicity, but gold price suppression is basically considered a matter of national security in the West, and it's pretty much a prohibited subject.
Actually, you know what? You've just answered what my next question was going to be, which is the common question I get. And again, we deal with family offices who have approached us recently for physical gold, thank goodness, because these guys were actually buying ETF gold. And their common question is, well, why do central banks suppress the price of gold? And I think really, I mean, you could delve in. I think there's so much information on the GATA site. and perhaps we'll look at that a little closer on some of the subjects. But can you, and you kind of outlined very, very well why central banks are involved, but you most recently got the support of Congressman Mooney to tackle the elephant in the room, which is, of course, to ask which markets governments trade in, and why do the CME offer volume discounts, for example, to government participants? Can you bring us up to speed on this, please, Chris?
Yeah, well, the whole scheme is very easily confirmed by the questions that government and international organizations will not answer. We have put to the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission a couple of key questions. That is, does Commission have jurisdiction over manipulative trading in the futures market by the U.S. government or by U.S. government agents? And even is the CFTC aware of trading in the futures market by the U.S. government or other governments or their agents? The CFTC has refused to answer those questions, not just for us, but Congressman Mooney as well. Our latest letter to the CFTC asks whether the CFTC has ever audited the gold claimed to be in COMEX vaults for futures trading, or possibly just accounting entries to deceive the world. The CFTC has not answered those questions either. Now, that they would ignore us is not surprising, but that they would avoid those very specific questions from Congressman Mooney, I think is very telling. I think that establishes that, yes, the U.S. government and international agencies allied with the U.S. government are intervening surreptitiously in the gold market every day for price control. If only we could get the mainstream financial news organizations to pose these questions as well and publicize the refusal to answer.
Yeah, I think it's largely due to the efforts of GATA's exposure of central bank endorsed gold price suppression efforts that the paper market open interest is evaporating from the COMEX. And that's something I discussed with your fellow director, Bill Murphy last week. But, look, GATA has documented enough real proof of gold and silver market manipulation. Chris, you're a journalist, and what I find so compelling about your work is that in every case you've backed up these assertions with links, which, when accompanied by a rash of additional empirical evidence, it makes life very difficult for the insiders who act as agent for the BI, for the Bank of International Settlements, and we can perhaps mention them in a minute. But I mean, these banks are privileged to hold gold accounts at the Bank of England, and they operate in the shadows. Now, there is very little money to be made in plain vanilla bullion banking. The evidence is now stacked up against them, and if they can't rig the price, then we will see more of the bad actors exit this space, and we're starting to see that. Now, we're evidencing the exit of the bullion banks, and that's something I'd like to talk about in a second. But Chris, what's your thoughts on this, especially as the primary market-making bullion banks, privileged to have these gold accounts at the Bank of England, acting as agents of the BIS, are one by one exiting? Is the jig up, Chris?
I've been thinking every week for 20 years that the rig couldn't get more obvious in play in these rigging markets, because the rigging requires deception. If nobody's deceived, if nobody plays, then it doesn't work. It's still going on. It will go on until the physical market overwhelms the paper market, and there just isn't as much gold to fulfill the normal day obligation that the market has. And I think that is what is happening. Certainly Russia and China long have been aware of the gold price suppression scheme of the West, have acted on this knowledge. The Bank of Russia even had a deputy chairman give a speech in 2004 where the only words of English he spoke were Gold Antitrust Action Committee. We had no idea the Russians were monitoring us back then. The gold price suppression, the WikiLeaks cables of Chinese government-controlled news reports were cabled back from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing to the State Department in Washington a few years ago, and translated, and they showed that the Chinese know all about gold price suppression by the U.S. government, and the United States knows that China knows all about price suppression by the U.S. government. So we think these major countries are acting on the knowledge, but they're still letting the scheme play out, I imagine, because both Russia and they'd like to have. I think basically they've been cooperating with the scheme for some time, and there was a couple of American economists, Lee Quaintance and Paul Brodsky, who wrote a paper about 8 years ago saying that us gold bugs should really just shut up and stop complaining, because the real central bank scheme here was to redistribute the world's gold reserves more fairly among central banks so that they were, all hedged against the eventual devaluation of the dollar. That be happening soon. I may live to see the day. I don't know, but I do know that everybody who is in the gold market is aware of this scheme. They just can't admit it.
Yeah, and I mean, Gatter's work has inspired a lot of us to also do what we can. But thanks to Gatter's work, I think democracy is gaining a tailwind. And I know it's been a long process, Chris, and you're a journalist, very pragmatic, and that's one thing we love about you. You say it as it is. But before we look at what we expect to ultimately unfold, and I do have some breaking news in a minute, can I ask your thoughts on exactly where we are right now, especially, and think, putting in the context of, we see the paper price being challenged by the global physical market exchanges. So that is an effect that, as a wholesaler, we see. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, there's certainly a lot more volatility in the gold market than there was before, and I think that indicates, big change. The transformation of the COMEX into all these exchange for physical transactions that get sent over to London is a big change. So, we can see that there are big changes happening, things that, we just never had seen before. And I think that indicates, your tectonic plates are shifting. But as to the reset in gold prices and currencies, they don't share that information with me. And I think there will be some announcement on a Sunday night just before the Asian markets open that the central banks have gotten together in Geneva somewhere, and there'll be another national currency revaluation. And part of it will be a much higher, more sustainable price for gold, the monetary metal. I imagine it will be a price where the central banks think that they can resume price suppression at a more sustainable level.
Yeah, I think what is so interesting, because I speak basically from a wholesale market perspective. So what I'm saying, though, Chris, is that I've never seen a situation like this in, 40 odd years of being in the gold business. Now, I think it's the exit of the K-Bell members. Now, obviously, you're absolutely correct, and of course, and it is centrally planned. But you need agent banks, and you can't do it all on your own. And these exit one by one. We're seeing these key K-Bell members exit. Now, that's interesting in itself. And I think this could seriously affect and bring this pricing revaluation up a lot quicker than we probably thought. Now, as we know, the gold market K-Bell has openly admitted they've been operating on a fractional reserve basis. We've industry apologists claiming 100 to 1 as normal. And we remember where that came from. But when accounting for related derivatives, we concur with many of the industry that 500 to 1 is much closer to the truth, if not more. And now, as the K-Bell of banks exit, these unbacked, unallocated gold and silver positions will have to be squared. Now, I think that's probably what you're referring to. There'll have to be some form of paper reset. But I think this is an appropriate moment, though, Chris, to break some news that will almost certainly impact pricing. I know I've shared this privately with you, but this is not known right now by the industry. And for exactly that reason, insiders have been keeping this news under wraps because it could cause a pricing issue. Now, with that in mind, let's look at Scotiabank for a minute. Although it is industry news that Scotiabank is exiting some parts of the bullion banking, they were reported to stay as market makers. So everyone rolled their eyes and said, well, what the hell is going to change? Well, evidence we uncovered this last few days telegraphs that Scotiabank is to exit the whole bullion banking space, lock, stock, and barrel. Now, what's not yet been announced is that Scotiabank itself is also withdrawing from the LBMA. Now, this is huge news, as they will no longer act as market makers. So this brings forward position squaring, in my view, it has to. And that's not all. Scotia is also withdrawn from acting as custodians. I mean, that's mind-blowing, because that's what drew our attention to this, was this recent statement from the associate LBMA member, BMG, that Scotiabank would be withdrawing as acting as custodian for them. Now, as a wholesaler, this immediately raises a red flag. You don't have to be a bullion bank to act as a custodian for physical metal. Custodianship is risk-free and a profitable source of income. So why would Scotiabank exit this business altogether? And much further digging last week revealed employees have been given termination notices with the proviso the bank will be fully shut down by year end. Now, in my opinion as a whistleblower, who's provided evidence to the CFTC and the DOJ, this is a forced regulatory decision. And I think this has to have come down from the regulators. But what about the lawsuits for market rigging? A US court filing in March, and I know GATA reported this, showed that Scotia had provided 800,000 pages of evidence to the regulators probing the metals trading at JP Morgan. Now, this paperwork undoubtedly revolves around the evidence we and GATA provided to the CFTC and the DOJ between 2019 and 2014. And we know for certain that these banks colluded to set gold and silver fixes on at least 88 instances that we proved and provided evidence of ahead of these market rigging attempts. Now, clearly, this was not the minor spoofing infractions the media is reporting right now. And as far as Scotia was concerned, head of trading, board member, and LBMA chairman Simon Weeks conducted this gold and silver, the gold and silver fixes during this exact period. Now, this raises the question, though: does Scotia have the physical bullion to back up paper positions? They're forced to square up these positions as they exit. Now, look, Chris, if there's ever any doubt, and I want people to know this, if there's ever any doubt, and I know you don't doubt this, that a major bullion bank acting as a custodian for holders of physical metal could be naked short bullion they don't have, then tune in for the next webinar on the 30th, where I will bring on someone very well known, and I know you know them, Chris, very well known to the gold space, to attest that when they went to audit their bullion at Scotia Makota flagship Canadian vault, it wasn't there. So, in summary, connect a few dots. Houston, we have a problem. Now, given the tightness in the wholesale supply and the improbable 1,800 tons of silver inflows into the SLV ETF over the last 5 weeks, something just doesn't add up. It's absolutely impossible for some 1,800 tons of silver to have entered the SLV vault in the last 5 weeks when the wholesale market has no size to sell any wholesaler. That this has to be leased bullion. And that raises the question about JP Morgan and Scotiabank. So, Chris, does any of this surprise you? Are we at the end game?
Well, we heard the end game. I'd like to move on to UFO or Bigfoot or something else like that. But these relationships suggest that Scotia going down is not just a problem for Scotia. It likely is a problem for other bullion banks, because Scotia's been using leased gold. It's been leasing it from somebody else. and everybody here is likely to be compromised. Now, it would be, very happy day for me to find out. Look, they're all naked short, and all these pieces of metal they claim to have are just accounting entries. And finally, the fractional reserve system has collapsed. But it's still operating. It's still operating today. But that there's collusion among these banks is, as you say, it's indisputed. That's been indisputable. It's been acknowledged. My real question is, how much this collusion has either been directed by governments or has been a matter of the bullion banks front running the trades they knew they were going to get to be executing for the government. That will be a very interesting question in the future as well.
Well, I think GATA's work over the years has really established the fact, the exact fact of what you're talking about. This, and I think it's now what used to be conspiracy theory is conspiracy absolute fact. And look, we've the same with the gold ETFs. I mean, there can only be one assumption. When the COMEX inflows have noted, and as a wholesaler, we can't get physical gold in any size, certainly not for spot. And bearing in mind the ETFs buy their bullion at spot, when we see 198 tons of inflows into the COMEX vaults and another 41 tons into the ETFs, I mean, with nothing available in size for the wholesale market, this gold has to be leased by the BIS. There is no one else that would have this bullion. Now, last week, GATA reported a large increase in BIS lease activity. Can you comment on that, please, Chris?
Sure. Our consultant about the BIS, Robert Lambourne, is probably the only person outside of central banking itself who follows the BIS very closely. He monitors their monthly statements of accounts. He reported a few days ago that the BIS's activity, I call it intervention in the gold market, as denoted by the footnotes of its statement of account for May, is at its highest point in 3 years. That the BIS has got, I think, like 412 tons of gold swaps or derivatives now on its books. That's up about 89 tons from the previous month, and this is the highest level of involvement by the BIS market in 3 years, which I think suggests a great amount of strain or a great number of fires that the central banks are trying to put out. You have to understand the BIS is the central bank representative for all the major central banks in the world. The BIS is not intervening in the gold market like this just for fun or for day trading, for its trading room. They are doing this at the express request instruction of its member central banks. This is daily intervention in the gold market by central banks, and this intervention has reached, according to Bob's calculations, its highest point in 3 years. That should be an indicator of great strain in the market, and I hope it's another indication of the crumbling of the fractional reserve system that you were talking about.
Yeah, and I think when you combine that with the exit, and again, this all links together. In my view, it's the if the regulators have finally been snookered by the likes of GATA's evidence, other people coming in, lawsuits, DOJ, CFTC finally being, and the DOJ have to oversee what the CFTC are failing to do. And when I met with the DOJ in Washington, they were absolutely, the English word is gobsmacked at the lack of action by the CFTC. Of course, until we found out the real reason, which as we left was, well, what about the economic consequences of this? So this very much adds up with everything you're saying. But look, if these banks are leaving, that one by one, it's evidence that we're now down to probably 2 real market makers from 6. it really leaves a much more difficult job for these guys who act as agent for the central banks and the BIS. Now, if what this does, though, and we discussed this with Bill last time, the net result, if we just focus on the COMEX for a moment, is the real open interest, which these banks used to populate at least 5%. I know 95% of the COMEX is algo driven, but at least 5% of it was somehow real. This real open interest, I bet you, is less than 2%, if not 1% at this point, now that we're seeing these exits of these banks. And I know that you recently put on the Financial Times piece on the Financial Times that would never speak to you. You put this piece on the Gatter the other day about this very same story about the banks no longer wanting to deal in this crooked CME casino.
Yes, and that's another indicator of big changes that are about here. The Financial Times had another story the other day that struck me as very unusual. Their columnist John Dizzard reviewed how not only old banks are withdrawing from the gold market or reducing their involvement, but new banks from various places around the world are getting in, and that the center of gravity for the gold market is moving away from London. It's moving away from the general Western government dominance of prices. Now, if you can get John Dizzard to write that in the Financial Times, which was essentially the newspaper's way of acknowledging that the market is evolving and changing, that's probably as close as we're going to get to having the Financial Times acknowledge that the gold market's not going to be forever what it is now. But again, you can make all the predictions in the world, and they're not really useful. I have to laugh at people saying that something is only a matter of time. Well, of course, everything is only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time before another asteroid strikes the world, and the dinosaurs come back. Now, I don't want to make predictions because it's hard enough for us just to find out what is. Of course, if you find out what is, you can get some hints about the future. But I'd like to believe that the future is tomorrow, and that free markets and transparent and limited and accountable government is going to come back any day now. But when I ever get that thought, I know it's time to go back to work.
Yeah, love it. Well, I think that's good that we keep our feet grounded, because, as you say, we need to be on our toes here, because this battle is never over till it's over. And I think really just a little bit of context from, again, I think from a wholesale market perspective, it does help to see the footprints out there. And although there are multiple bullish drivers that should propel gold and silver much higher in the short, the medium, and the long term, it ignores the elephant in the room. And of course, this is not what the media talks about. It's the trigger for a massive spike higher in both gold and silver prices is the wholesale exit of these first and second tier bullion banks trading CME futures. And you just referred to the Financial Times articles. They're writing about this exit of the CME market makers back to London. And I know that we know of that the second tier banks that got burned so badly when the paper market broke on March the 23rd need a proper hedging tool. They are forbidden from trading on the CME. The bulk of these banks are still suffering heavy losses. Now, so the unwind of this paper market liquidity really exposes and brings to account the scale of this massive, deeply underwater, unallocated gold positions, which they won't be able to square at current prices. And you've just alluded to that. But what is also interesting, mark-to-market losses, such as those reported by HSBC in the mainstream, are just the tip of the iceberg. The scale of the aggregated losses incurred by the second-tier banks and trading houses has resulted in a much larger outflow of lifeblood liquidity. Now, The CME is scrambling. They've put a 4GC contract in place. It's pathetic. They've doubled open interest. They're desperately trying to restore confidence by increasing registered inventories. But once trust is lost, it's gone forever. And I will actually place a wager that HSBC will be the next bank to exit the COMEX vaults, while the reported 200 million of losses were also reported as largely recovered. What's not reported, and this is what we know for certain, was that the losses burned by HSBC FX traders, foreign exchange traders, some reports suggest it was closer to 2 billion, Chris. HSBC likely exits their COMEX vault. I would strongly suggest that there is no requirement for them to be in a vault, provide liquidity in a vault when you've got open interest disappearing. But Chris, finally, it's really often forgotten, and I know this is very important to you. It's often forgotten that the market manipulations on the scale we've discussed have a real world impact, affecting lives all over the world, usually of depressed and under supported people. Now, I just want to thank you really for everything you do, and I cannot thank you enough for being so generous with your time. Now, you and Bill are truly warriors leading a battle for good, and I know you understate yourself, and it's a marvelous thing. But can you tell viewers interested in learning more about GATA where they can find the evidence you've documented over the years and support you in every way they can possibly, whether it's financially, whether it's, again, any way, or to be assistant to you, to perhaps provide evidence for you? Can you tell them where they can find you?
Oh, sure. Our internet site is gat.org. My email address is there, but I can give it to you. It's WL@gata.org. We usually put out several dispatches a day to our email list. People can join that list, internet site, in the column there. Of course, we do have a few very wonderful supporters who I think are going to make sure we don't fail. My companies are too scared of their governments and their banks, and I understand that. But somehow our friends have provided for us, and we'll get through this week. If anybody wants to help us next week, even a few people who are dedicated to a cause can make a big difference. And the governments here are so damn vulnerable. They can't, and when you can't answer questions, you broadcast that you're doing something you're ashamed of, or something that people would see that's wrong. And the suppression of the gold price is part of a much larger scheme of the suppression of commodity prices, generally a scheme of the exploitation, expropriation of the developing world, the commodity producing countries. And it's really part of the Western imperialism and the U.S. imperialism of the dollar. People forget that Nazi Germany did not expropriate occupied Europe during the Second World War by running the Gestapo around with bayonets and stealing the paintings off the walls and things like that. Nazi Germany expropriated occupied Europe during World War II through currency market rigging. They got a hold of all the central banks and they changed the exchange rates so that all the production in occupied Europe flowed into Nazi Germany and nothing flowed back. That's how the Nazis expropriated occupied Europe, through rigging the currency markets. And I'm afraid that's exactly what the West is doing now to the rest of the world.
Oh, that's so well put. And I think it helps us to see it for what it is. And obviously, you're referring to the US dollar now, I suppose.
Yes, the dollar is the mechanism of imperialism in the world today. Yeah, a patriotic American, and I want my country to do what I want to be the example to the world. I don't want it to be oppressing the world and expropriating the world. If we provide the example of democracy and accountable limited government, we'll remain the leaders of the world. But if we we try to control the world through currency market rigging. We don't deserve to lead anything.
Chris, this has been such a privilege for me for us to be with you. I really, if there's anything we can do to support you, we will. Would love to have you on again one day when we don't have such bad internet connection. I would have loved to have carried on a little, but I know that we're breaking up a little bit here. It's probably to do with all the lockdown and everyone struggling for bandwidth. But yeah, please come back soon.
Everybody's home.
And we'd love to have you on again.
Thank you, Andrew. We appreciate all you do.
Thank you, Chris. That was absolutely fantastic. Now, not to forget, guys, next time on our next show, we bring on this guest that we referred to in the earlier on, which is going to walk us through what happened when they turned up at Scotia to audit their bullion and found it wasn't there. Join us. It's going to be spectacular.
Well, thank you so much, Andy, and especially thank you to Chris Powell, our special guest from GATA. I told you this call was going to be awesome. I told you this episode is going to be fantastic. And if you like this episode, make sure you hit the like button and share it and get this information out to people you care about, not now, but right now. Next call on our next episode, we have another special guest you're not going to want to miss. And so with that, we will see you next time on Live from the Vault. Bye for now.